In the day of print media, we may come to the end of seeing newspapers, magazines, and even books as we transform ourselves onto social media or electronic platforms. Is this the case? Well, on today's episode, we're going to be speaking to the seasoned writer and finding out what's happening in the future. Welcome to the Secret Men's Business Podcast. In today's show, we're going to be speaking to seasoned writer Scott Newton. He's going to be telling us about his journey into writing and what he thinks the field or the landscape in regards to print media is all about now. So let's welcome to the show Scott Newton. Scott, how are you?
Good, thanks, mate. How you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us. So, media, writing, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into becoming a writer?
I guess it started pretty early in my formative years. My mum was a kinder teacher. A lot of my friends who got into writing said, they had that early influence. And then I guess you notice the sheer power of narrative when you're quite young and one of your first favourite books or your first authors. It started out with Dr. Seuss, and then for me, went to an author like Jack Vance, who was a really good fantasy writer, and he was often listed by people like George R. Martin as one of their influences. So that guy must have a lot to answer for. And then people like Ondaatje and so forth, and you realise that power of that. And then the next logical step is when something takes your fancy to go and study it, and that's what I did at Swinburne in the late 90s. Studied writing and editing so that I knew what the rules were so that I could break them, basically. Because
And what type of writer are you? Are you a novelist? Do you write articles? Do you what type of writing do you follow?
Freelance write predominantly, so non-fiction writing, but also I think most writers would dabble in poetry or creative writing. I've done short stories. I've been in short story comps and things. And look, I think there's a novel in me, but it hasn't come out yet. So I don't think as a writer you necessarily want to pigeonhole yourself, or at least not for me. You want to feel like you can do a bit of everything.
Okay. In your time, I guess, as a writer, have you had any major accomplishments? Is there anything major that you've been able to look back at and say, "Wow, that was a really big moment for me"? An interview, maybe, or a piece.
Look, interviews are great, and I have had some really good ones. But I'm gonna take you right back to inception. The start, and I think that making your initial breakthrough, and for me, that was one of the most revelatory things. It's one of those things saying, I can do this. And for me, I didn't start writing freelance until basically I was into my early 30s. And I was changing streams. And, you're pitching away and you're hoping you're going to break through. And for my first sort of breakout piece was I interviewed Australia's best birdwatcher. His name's Chris Doughty. Amazing. He's what they call a big lister.
Wow.
And so that means he had seen over 7,500 of the birds in the world, and there's 10,000 species. Wow. And no one had ever interviewed this guy before. No one had ever thought to interview him. And so I went out there and we had a really great chat. And because I'm a bit of a bird kind of nut as well, not an ornithologist, but someone that's recorded quite a few, we had a lot in common. And so I pitched to quite a few different outlets. Australian Geographic ended up wanting it, and so did The Age at the same time. And it was one of those moments where you get this ray of light and you're like, wow, I can do this. And so that sticks out in my memory more than anything else. Despite some other, really good interviews I've had and so forth, it's that moment where you say, I can do it. I can change streams. And that might resonate with some of your listeners, if they want to dabble in something different, and that it's the impetus that you get from that. So it's your launching platform. And for me, nothing's stood out since. It was like nearly $1,000 for the piece at the time, which seemed great. And you print that up there, right, with all your rejection letters as well.
Yeah, I guess. So have you had many obstacles along the way? What's it like financially or career-wise to be a writer?
It's one of those really tricky fields. There are plenty of obstacles. Let me just have a couple of notes. I did make some. The demons are many in that line of work, because you've got to self-motivate. You need to be a self-starter. You need a string of decent ideas coming out all the time. And you likely want to cultivate a niche so you've got a relationship with certain editors so that you can at least keep drawing in that vein, rather than having to cold start with a new editor every time. So if you can find something, like for me, like I said, I've got a affinity for the natural world. I love birds and so forth. That's one corner. And on a completely different note, I am interested in modern media, like video games. And so I've had a lot to do with that side, interviewing voice directors and creative directors, for games, Ubisoft personnel and so forth. So two completely different things, but that I can draw on. And so you need thick skin if you're going to be a freelancer. You get constant rejection, and you need to know that's not a personal thing. It's editors have their dome lights on sometimes, and they're going to be interested in what you've got to sell, and other times they won't. And in today's landscape, it's even tougher because with COVID, you've got much less advertising dollars. So the editors have got less money to spend on freelancers, and they concentrate on in-house. So lots and lots of obstacles there. And writing, of course, is rewriting. And so you need to understand all of those things if you're going to be successful. Also, you often have times where it's so quiet that it can be worth having fallback vocations. And that's been true of me as well. I mean, I've been in different corners of the book world. I've worked in bookstores as manager, as in marketing, in HR. So you can't always necessarily expect to have your whole trajectory just be writing. And personally, I've liked to use that as something where I can break up the monotony, because it's a profession where you're isolated, you're by yourself, and then that the demons get in your head, and you think, am I good enough? And you've got all these self-doubts, and then you can use other people as sounding boards. So being in other areas of that world, even, I think that's helpful.
I mean, this podcast is directed to men and mental health. So just going back to your point about having a thick skin and dealing with rejection, do you think that that in times of no work that could impact a writer's mental health?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it could. And so that's why just having, you can't always draw from yourself. It's so important to have people around you and in your life, or someone you can speak to use as soundboards, to, talk about your fears and anxieties, because they're not weaknesses. They're strengths you can build on ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think that's, as men, so often we're, taught to be strong and tough. But if you accept and embrace the things that you might be fearful of, I think you're so much better off.
Yeah, I love that. I've been speaking to another writer. I'm not sure if you've heard of Holden Shepherd. He wrote a book called The Invisible Boys in WA. Have you heard? He won the award for Best New Writer.
Rings a bell. I'll admit I've not read it, or I don't know enough
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah, like it's just interesting just hearing how you can draw on your own experiences and how you can use that to create characters and write books and so on. I guess on that point, like you mentioned coronavirus and, the landscape's changing. So how do you see writing developing? Like I know in our conversation on the phone the other day, you were sharing some things about how different it is in regards to getting royalties and so on. So like how does the landscape change with in, I guess, print media and in just even reading books? Like I have not bought a proper book. Everything I buy now is on Kindle, right? So I haven't had a book in my hand for a long time. So, like, what's your opinion on that?
Look, I think in some ways there will still be a market for a good old-fashioned book. Some people love the smell of them, they love the feel of them. But you're absolutely right. The landscape is changing. It's completely changed for freelancers over the years, because the advent of the internet means there's so much content that's flooded onto the market. Anyone can write anything, and so you've got to, as an editor, winnow the wheat from the chaff more than ever. They can just say, look, this is worth $250, take it or leave it. There are industry standards, but they can easily ignore those. So, and then as far as books go, you're right. People are reading them on Kindles. You've got the search algorithms that Google use, that Amazon use to recommend other books that you might like based on what you have liked. So that can lead you down a bit of a rabbit hole, though, because you end up with a lot of popular books in circulation and in the mind's eye of the public. And then
Right.
you've always got to be careful about leaving the mid-list authors behind, all those little ones, because your old-fashioned bookstores, unfortunately, that's true, they are disappearing. I used to
Yeah.
work in one that had been going for over 30 years. And a really good staff person that can hand sell a book well, like a manager I worked with, she was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. She still works at Readings today. And she reads 3 books a week, right?
Mm.
No joke.
Yeah.
Sometimes. So the amount of, if you do that year after year, you can imagine the amount of stuff that you could recommend, you could hand sell to someone. So she's a champion of those mid-list authors. She's not always reading the bestsellers. And sometimes I think you lose that when you get into the cloud, into the world
Commercialism,
of,
isn't it?
yeah.
Because even like I was thinking when you were saying that, like even the popularity now of audio books, like people aren't even reading anymore. People are just listening. It's like this whole experience of getting into bed and reading a book is even that's changed. What about things like how do you navigate fake news when it comes to articles and things like that? Like you were saying, anyone can write an article. So as a person that's going to be reading the stuff on the internet, how do I know? How do you know what's true or what's true, what to read or not to read? Like
Well,
as a writer, what do you do?
you know, it's so hard. You can't easily do that because we've always got our own biases, and we've got confirmation bias. We'll read something that we agree with, and that'll take us down that path. And I think the best thing you can do is find people who you really respected as analysts or other people that have written stuff that you've cleaved to. A handful of those, whether they're video essayists or whatever else, a few of those, and also people around you who you respect, that you've known for a long time. Go back to what they have to say about it. Don't get insular. Don't get stuck in your own world. Don't go down the conspiracy theory rabbit holes, and really think about everything that you're reading. Not just, is it well written? Does this make sense? Is it logical? Is it reasonable? But look at the counter arguments. If you and then assess those. If you're only going to believe what you're reading straight up and not look at what the other side is, and that's, I think, any good investigative writer would look to what other sides, what other corners of the hat there are that they can draw into. Find out what's true. It's so hard with
it is
fake
hard,
news.
isn't it? I mean, I was going to ask you, what do you think is what's the reason for fake news? I don't even know. Like, what is it? Is it about circulation? Like, why is there fake news so popular? Is it for the people that are posting it to make money? I mean, I don't understand the rationale of it. Like, where did it all come from?
I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that, and I think if we go down that path, we'll be in entirely different.
Yeah,
but
true.
I think people like to think, like to feel that they know something that no one else knows. There's part of that there. In times of stress, you sometimes look outside your ordinary bubble. You can't understand why things are working in the workaday world the way they've been working before. And then you go outside of that bubble, and there is actually definitely good information out there and different information, but then it's also a minefield of stuff that you can get drawn into. There's
I'm more interested about not the story itself, but more, is that the reason why that the landscape's changed? Is it because they've opened it up electronically to anyone, which means that fake news can start to come into circulation without anyone saying anything? While I remember when I was a little boy reading the paper, there was only 2 papers in Melbourne back then, right? And so that every sort of writer in there was credible, but now it seems there are certain circulations that aren't credible versus things that are credible. You know what I mean? Like what you were saying, sticking with the same people that you know. It's just interesting how those good days of just reading the paper and getting the news, like at the end of the day, is now changed. How the news now is instant, and it could be, and I could be reporting the news because I could have the camera out filming it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The thing is that journalism, if you go back far enough, it was held to a bit of a different standard. And these days, with the advent of the internet, literally anyone can say anything. So you do the math. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
you're gonna end up with so much more that is not well researched, not well interpreted, not well understood. We've got so many different things vying for our attention these days, which, again, going back into your books and your Kindles, which is why we've got our attention directed in so many different areas.
Mm.
But yeah, it becomes really, really tough to find good, noteworthy journalism. And in this country, it's nearly filtered down to the fine point of a good investigative Four Corners reporter, and little else.
Mm.
Um, you
Yeah.
know, so yeah, again, we might be getting into a different conversation talking about the fake
No,
news, but
I think it's all relevant. Like, I mean, like if we're talking about the future, do you have faith that we are going to stay on track with are people still going to be able to write? You think? Like, is there still enough landscape in our lives to warrant a writer?
well, there's always things to write about. Just like there's always things to sing about.
True.
I can hear a new song and love it, and it might be about something I've heard a million times before, but a slightly different interpretation. I think that's true of writing as well.
Mm.
And I think you were talking about, well, one of the questions that you had for me might have been about, could anyone write a novel?
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you that now.
Yeah.
Like, like a famous chef said to me once that anyone could cook. Like, do you think anyone can write?
Do you mean a novel?
Or not? Yeah, a book. Like, if I
Yeah.
was to write my story, because I've had a lot of stuff happening in my life, do you think that if anyone, everyone's story and everyone has the ability to write, or do you think that's a gift that people that have?
It's a tough question. Anyone can write, sure. Can everyone? No.
No.
It's a bit, because my analogy is, can everyone play tennis? Sure, everyone can play tennis. You can hit the ball over the net. Can
Yeah.
anyone play it to a high standard? It depends whether you've got the dedication and discipline to do that. Maybe a better analogy would be, can anyone direct a movie? It's such an unwieldy thing. There's so many moving parts,
Mm.
that you need the dedication, application, the
And the
ability to
insight.
study it. Look, anyone could write a book. You can self-publish.
Yeah.
So in that sense, but then the question becomes, is it a good book?
Yeah,
Um,
because the thing I was going to compare it to is, like, we're talking about your friend that works at Readings. Like, some of the best-selling books aren't good books.
that's exactly what I was going to say. Cough, 50
Like,
Shades. But
yeah,
but the thing is, that's absolutely true. So it's a tough question, but if you wanted to just pick up on one thread about good writing, characters. If you want to talk about character mapping or character arcs, do the characters make value changes? Are they flawed? They'd want to be, because how many people do you know that aren't flawed?
mm,
Maybe there's room to write about some characters that aren't in some novels. If you've got too many characters, as a writer, you often want to do what they call tunneling, tunnel them into one character so that they become more complex. Do your characters leak sawdust? When they talk about things that wouldn't? John Grisham often had that leveled at him, that his characters could be a bit wooden. But on the other hand, he was absolutely brilliant at creating conflict in his plot lines and constant conflict in his dialogue, which propelled you through the narrative.
mm,
And so all of that I've talked about is just a small facet of one aspect of writing, which is character. So you can imagine all the other things you have to keep in mind when you're writing a novel. You've got to sit down, you've got to glue your butt to the seat. As Stephen King said in his memoirs, you need butt glue. You need to be able to, day in, day out, sit down and write something, even if you don't want to.
mm. And I guess you also just need to have the fundamental ability to have grammar. Like, 'cause so many people write, like, and they use the wrong language and all that. So I guess, as our final question, like, if our listeners were interested in writing a novel or writing something, like, what advice would you give them in regards to how to start? Because I know that you went to school and did it. Do you recommend that people should study, or do you think that there's a simpler way to get started?
You don't necessarily have to have tertiary study behind you for it, but I would definitely recommend finding a creative writing course, because, or at least a book from someone that has written a novel that's telling you about how to write a novel, or to start the creative process, because you want to know what the basic rules are As I said, often because you want to be able to break them, but not look like an idiot while you're doing it.
Mm.
There are tenets of good story writing. There's classic structure, where you have a backstory, you have inciting incident for a character. They have a goal. They have progressive complications. There's a crisis. There's a climax. There's a resolution. That's classic structure. If you don't know that and you can't apply it simply and easily, then you're missing out on something. And you don't want to write something that is like a blockbuster because it's antithetical to a breakout work. You don't want to write a cookie cutter. So knowing some of those things and knowing what some of the basic literary plots are, whether it's rebirth or voyage and return or comedy or tragedy, those sort of things are universal themes. They're cautionary tales that you can tell because good writing often reflects what's going on in society. And it changes and evolves over time.
Yeah. Scott, you've inspired me. When I was younger, I used to write, and I've got them hidden away somewhere. I think I'm going to pull them out today and have a little read of my little stories and probably be shocked how bad they are.
I'm sure. If they mean something to you, writing can be cathartic.
Yeah. Scott, thank you so much for being part of our podcast today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and learn about writing and to learn about you.
Good to speak to you, Joe.
Thank you. You've been listening to the Secret Men's Business podcast. The new podcast is out on Monday, so don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, iTunes, and Google Manager and Podomatic. Okay, thank you, everyone. See you next time. Bye.